أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I'm not normally nervous when I do these, but I'm a little bit nervous to have with us Scott Kugle, who is a research scholar in comparative religion and Islam. One of the reasons why I'm nervous is because he has such a long and I think academically rigorous engagement with Islamic scholarship on the matter of sexual diversity and human dignity. And this will be something I will be asking him about as we go along. He became a Muslim gradually in his mid-20s, and now that he's in his 30s, seems like longer than that. He goes by the name Siraj al-Haqq. He grew up in Hawaii. He went to Philadelphia to attend Swarthmore College, and then he did his PhD in religious studies with a focus on Islamic theology and ethics at Duke University in North Carolina. He now serves as professor at Emory University in Atlanta in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, where he teaches courses on Islamic history in South Asia, on gender and sexuality in Islamic history, and on gender and sexuality in Islamic ethics, as well as on Sufism. He's conducted research in India, Pakistan, Morocco, and the Netherlands. He has lived for many years in Hyderabad, India, where he found his Sufi teacher and learned from him over a decade. He's published 7 books and many articles. 2 new books are coming out this year. The first is on Sufi Hadith scholars from India and their efforts to make social reform in Mughal Empire. And the second is a memoir about his experiences with his Sufi teacher who passed away in 2013. May Allah be pleased with him. Professor Siraj, please.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you, and I'm honored to take part in these conversations. I don't know why you're nervous. That's silly. You shouldn't be nervous. I should be the one who's nervous. Anyway, it's great to join you. Do you want me to simply begin speaking, or do you want to open with question, or how shall we?
I am flexible with regard to that. I have many questions for you. Normally, I just let the speaker do their own self-introduction, and that's why I kind of like throw some questions there beforehand. And then I do a little intervention, and then I start with a question, and then we go into the question and answer part of it. But I've also had guests who just prefer that I ask them questions. So okay. You can choose, and I will follow suit. What would you like?
I guess I'll speak for a little bit, and then just a little bit, and then I'd rather follow your questions, actually, because you know your audience and you know what they might be interested in. So we'll leave most of the time for you to ask questions, and I can reply to those.
All right.
But yeah, the introduction that you gave is really very complete, and I thank you for that. It's a challenge to be teaching in the US now, but one of the great joys I have is to be able to teach a course called Gender, Sexuality, and Islam. And you know, I just had my undergraduates read this amazing book, which is, you can't see it there, but it's yours, Amina, you know, Quran and Woman. So you know, one of the fun things I get to do is to teach your writings to my students, along with those of Asma Barlas and Fatima Mernisi and other great scholars of Islam and feminism over the years. So it's kind of fun for me to teach that material and watch the students react to it, and just find how provocative it still is, even after so many decades. And then part of my career and my interest is to try to add to that. I see your work, Amina, and those of other scholars who have worked on gender and feminism and Islam as the foundation for any work that I have gone on to do, looking at sexuality and sexual diversity in Islamic ethics. So most of my time, very frankly, over the past decade has been focused on teaching. I work with graduate students, PhD students, as well as undergraduates nowadays. But I love to do research and to write, and I would love to focus on that more, really. And I think maybe in the next decade, as I think of my life in 10-year segments, I would really like to teach less and do more research and writing. And maybe, Amina, that's a state that we share. Because life is short. I mean, the pandemic is really showing me how fragile everything is, and how vulnerable we all are, and how precious life is. And I would really like to think things through more systematically and write down the few things that I've learned. And teaching in the classroom sometimes seems, it's a challenge, but it sometimes seems to get in the way of being able to dedicate what little time I have. You know, in terms of sexuality and gender diversity in Islam, I've written, maybe I can give you a brief history of my work in that field. You know, the 9/11, the September 11 attacks happened just when I was beginning my career teaching. And there was a book that came about with about 14 scholars. Amina, I think you were part of that, the Progressive Muslims volume, edited by Omid Safi. And that was in 2001, where many scholars got together to try to contribute something. And Omid contacted me and said, would you write a chapter on homosexuality in Islam? And I said, no, thanks. I don't want to do that. He said, no, but somebody has to do it. You know, we can't publish a book on progressive Islam as a kind of statement against fundamentalism and violence and all of the rhetoric that's come about in America and Europe and further afield after 9/11, which is kind of painting a very negative stereotype picture of Islam. We have to speak back to that. And speaking back to it is not going to be complete unless the issue of homosexuality is in the picture. And I said, you're absolutely right, Omid Safi, and somebody else should write that chapter because I can't. And I have to thank Omid Safi for being really, really persistent. And he just stayed on me until I agreed. And having agreed to do that, I didn't know what I was getting into. I approached the topic fairly naively, I think, but it started off an aspect of my career that I find deeply rewarding and spiritually nourishing. And I hear back from a lot of people who read the work that I ended up doing, saying that it had a positive effect on their own lives or the lives of their family members who are struggling with issues of marginalization or victimization because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. So after that chapter that came out in 2002, I thought, well, there has to be a fuller study. You know, that was just one chapter. It's just like the tip of an iceberg. And so I applied for a research grant in the Netherlands at the University of Leiden. Back in those days, they had something called the Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World at Leiden. And they gave me a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship to go and do a more complete research project. And that project included interviews with queer Muslim activists in the UK and the Netherlands and South Africa, as well as Canada and the US. And so I went into that wanting to do a kind of liberation theology project. I had read Asghar Ali Engineer, and I had read other writers who have taken a kind of liberation theology approach to Islamic studies. And I thought, that's the approach I want. And it involves talking to living people, activists, organic intellectuals, you could call them, like Mohsen Hendricks in South Africa, or like Imam Da'i Abdullah in America, or Faisal Alam in America, or El Farouk Kaki in Canada at that time. Most of those characters are men. Many of the women at that time, this was in the early 2000s, many of the women were a little bit in the shadows and quite cautious about making their names known publicly as leaders. So I was able to interview several women, but many of them didn't want their names to be published. And there weren't very many vocal, out and open spokespeople in the queer Muslim community who were women at that time. And as I was doing this project, this was from 2004 to 2006, I didn't know it, but there was a woman named Samar Habib who was doing her PhD in Australia at that time. She's a Palestinian woman, and came out eventually with a book on female and Islam in the Middle East and in Arabic literature. And her approach and mine were very, very different. Not because she's female and I'm male, but because I was taking a very theological approach based in Islamic studies, and she was taking a more secular approach based in human rights discourse. But the two, I think, ended up being very complementary, and they came out at roughly the same time. As I was writing, I wish I had known that she was working independently. We could have helped each other so much, but we got to know each other later, Amina, partly through your friendship and mentorship that led us to cross paths several times. So after that, I was able to publish two books. One is called Homosexuality in Islam, and that is mostly the theological and ethical part of the study that I did, because that's what publishers wanted to put out there quickly. It was very difficult for me to find a publisher for the second book, and that's called Living Out Islam. And it's mostly interviews with living activists in that I mentioned. I had done interviews with them. It seemed like the lives of real people weren't as interesting to publishers as the more provocative things about interpreting the Quran or critiquing Sharia and some of the pre-modern notions of Islamic law. I can understand that from the point of view of a publisher, right? They want to have something that's considered provocative, that might sell more. But the lives of real people, I thought, were much more interesting and frankly more, more urgent for folks to learn about and to learn from. But it took a long time for that book to get published, but it now exists. And that's pretty much where I stand. I've been invited to contribute a chapter to a book on Quran interpretation. That is how the Quran is interpreted and received differently by different communities. And I did contribute a chapter to that. It's called Communities of the Quran, is the edited book. And that showed me that actually there's much more to do about Quran interpretation. So in the future, I hope to do a book that focuses much more on some of the intricacies of interpreting the Quran, especially the verses on Qawm Lut, which I had done some interpretation and reinterpretation of, but it's not satisfying people, it seems. Some readers of my book write back to me and say, yes, but what about Qawm Lut? I said, but didn't you read what I wrote? And they said, but what about Qawm Lut? You know, people are a little bit obsessed. So I think another full book that maybe gets into some of the micro details that I might have passed over in broad brushstrokes is required. I think especially for members of the Muslim community who who may be a little more conservative in their mindset and aren't convinced that sexual diversity and gender pluralism, it should be an inherent part of Islam. I think they need a very detailed Quran-focused book. Perhaps I'm gonna like your book, Quran and Woman, that's just very, very focused on the meaning of words, the nuance of words, something like that. So that's where I am. I don't know when I'll have the time to put that book together, but it's brewing in my mind. And it's been brewing, frankly, since the Pulse nightclub shooting. If you remember, that was way back in, I think it was 2016. Seems like a long time ago now, but there was a shooting at a nightclub here in the US, in Florida, at a gay nightclub. And it was a mass murder, really. I think about 50 people were killed. I don't know the exact number. By a Muslim gunman, unfortunately, who may have been mentally unstable, or maybe even mentally ill, or may have been aligned to certain fundamentalist or militant interpretations of Islam. It's really quite unclear what motivated him. But that incident, I think I want to use to frame a deeper analysis of the Quran. Because even though it's been many years since that event happened, I don't think anybody has done justice to it yet in terms of scholarship. So I want to put those two issues together, dealing with the mass murder and dealing with the Quran in a very detailed way. Those are my plans.
Wow, so exciting. I'm going to take up a few of those threads just to say, you know, why I'm nervous. Actually, I misrepresented you because the chapter you have in Progressive Muslims was just so profound for me. I remember Omid saying to me, as a matter of fact, that you know, was sort of methodologically, you know, aligned with my own work on gender. Still to this day, I refer to it because you're right, there is, you know, a paucity of information that is accessible at multiple levels. There are some very deep and erudite work, which is much more difficult to work through for especially this very vast, diverse, and beautiful population of queer Muslim activists. So that article that chapter is very accessible, and it was the first place where I came across the idea that interpretation is always active, it's always alive, it's always divergent, and that diversity is an important part to keeping the Quran alive and keeping living people in a relationship with the Quran, instead of this notion of like canon, you know, like this is what it means and that's all that it means. And in regard to the Qawm Lut, the people of Lut, and the Quran's treatment of it, however sparse it is as well, I find that everybody is a Quran expert. They're going to tell you exactly what it means. And one of the methodologies that I want to, you know, similarly with you, continue working with regard to the Quran is actually the embrace of ambiguity. Ambiguity as a method of guidance, instead of qat'i, you know, like everything is specific, which, you know, we do have that kind of black-white thinking in the context of Islam and Muslims. It's like, you know, it's either halal or haram, you know, and where legally, you know, there was a spectrum, I think, you know, culturally, Muslims want to have like the right answer. And when I was doing my research, I kept feeling like I was going to find the right answer. And the answer that I came away with was how significant it is to embrace ambiguity and to embrace it as an intentional part of Quranic guidance. I think Amir Amanullah Dasundi uses the word sublime sublime ambiguity about the Quran's projection of the notions of masculinity. So I think that's worth going. The reason why I was nervous was because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, which now I see is moot, is how difficult it was to engage in the study of sexual diversity under the umbrella of Islam, or Islamic studies, I should say. I am working on an initiative for which I am currently pushing through the launching of an online portal called Qist, for the word in the Quran that means justice in harmony and balance, which stands for Queer Islamic Studies and Theology. And the necessity to engage it as a part of the discourse of Islamic thought, as well as to understand those living communities, what people like Musa will talk about, lived reality as an aspect of interpretation. Sadia Sheikh also has an excellent article that she published on how lived realities become themselves a rubric of analysis. And because there is such a burgeoning of queer activism, to me, this wedding, that Sisters in Islam and Musawa, and also local groups here in Indonesia, among the women activists and scholars have embraced, that there is a relationship between Islamic scholarship and specific kinds of social justice movement. And so those two have to stay in conversation. But I am trying to push for the integration of queer Islam as part of Islamic studies, keeping in mind that when I got my PhD, for example, I couldn't get a PhD in Islamic studies in the United States. It wasn't offered. And then when I retired, one of the motivations was the absence of Islam and gender studies in US academia and globally, but it was moving in different speeds at different places. And now what I want to do is to be a part of a movement that makes a mandate to all studies of Islam to include aspects of sexuality, sexual identity, sexual integrity, sexuality, and spirituality. And so when I read your article way back, the early part of the 2000s, I always thought that had been your area of study. And I wanted to ask you, how difficult was it to be able to pull that out when there were no means of direct institutional support? And you went on to do the postdoc in the Netherlands. Remember we rode the bikes together? I went to see the Van Gogh Museum.
Yeah, that was great.
Amazing experience.
When I was living there in Amsterdam, Amina, you were invited to give it was a very big lecture, actually.
It was a huge event. Yeah.
It was a huge event, and there was a lot of security. I remember there was just before that, there had been a murder, actually. Theo van Gogh, the film director, a Dutch film director, had been murdered on the street. And so there was a great deal of, probably too much of a reaction, a kind of a homophobic reaction. What am I talking about? Islamophobic reaction on the part of the Dutch Academy and the security services. But you were surrounded by 4 or 5 policemen all the time. But I met you at the back of the theater after you were done your talk, and I said, this looks really uncomfortable. Do you want to get out of here? And you said, yeah, let's go get a coffee. I said, okay. So we went out back, and you looked, and there's only a bicycle. And you thought, how are we going to go around on this bicycle? I said, this is Amsterdam. Come on, jump on the back of the bicycle. So off we pedaled. And it was a great escape from a very serious situation otherwise. Yeah, we've had some good adventures over the years.
Yeah, and yet when you look at the field of study, And especially, I'm glad that you mentioned the Pulse incident, because to me, that was a prime opportunity, and let me be honest with regard to it, for the Muslim confessional community to begin to have serious conversations about sexuality, not just sexual diversity, but inclusive of sexual diversity as part of the discourse. And instead, what we've seen manifest are huge, scandalous and sexual abusive accusations and confirmations on the part of certain Muslim leadership. So instead of engaging it, I think one of the reasons why I love your article in Progressive Muslim so much is the statement that you make about, why is there so much prudishness with regard to discourse over sexuality when that was not the way it was dealt with in Islamic thought, especially I've confirmed over the first 500 years of Islam. There was very frank, very detailed, very honest, and also very inclusive conversations about sexuality. So it's a part of our tradition. And, obviously that transformation through colonialism, we not only lost it, but we became advocates to push back on it. And that's where I think it's time for us to start standing our ground. So, I just was curious about how you managed to even engage in serious study when there was no trail, there was no pathway.
It was difficult because I didn't have any model to go on, but there was already a foundation of women Muslim thinkers who had done significant work about method, critical method, sort of embracing Islamic belief, but having great skepticism about the Islamic textual legal tradition as it had been constructed by elite men. So the groundbreaking work had already been done. All I needed to do was to take that method and apply it to different texts, different verses in the Quran, different set of hadith reports, a different masala, a different issue from the Islamic legal discourse. And as you know, the starting point for me was feminist Islamic discourse, which was, your work as well as the work of Asma Barlas and other scholars. The more I read that work, the more, and it's deepened over time, I realized that the feminist theological engagement was actually really indebted to Fazlur Rahman and Ustad Mahmoud Taha and some, earlier reformist thinkers from the mid 20th century, who we don't necessarily think of as feminists, but were laying the groundwork for a kind of critical methodology for reviving Islamic spirituality and ethics, while getting away from some of the crusted, hard, coercive elements of Islamic law and Sharia as it had been passed to us from, the medieval times. So that there were resources out there. There just weren't any resources that were identified as queer or gay friendly. And that luckily has been a growing field. I'm not alone. As I mentioned, Samar Habib has done a lot of work at the same time that I was doing my initial work. And now, there are many other people who are publishing in this field. And there's a whole generation of students coming up who are doing master's degrees and now PhDs, who are going to really change the landscape because they're now able to do a PhD on queer Islamic studies, which didn't exist when I was doing a PhD. I mean, when I was doing a PhD, we were lucky to be able to read feminist Islamic discourse, so, and I'm about academically a generation younger than you, Amina. So every generation, the field opens a little bit more as people build on the previous work of scholars that came 10, 20 years before. So I think we're going to see some amazing things in the next 10 or 20 years. And
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic as well. I think the mandate is already there. and the burgeoning of I mean, like one of the consequences of the pandemic is that we have to learn new teaching modalities, teaching and learning modalities. And the queer Muslim activists and artists, they didn't wait for the academy, is the thing that I like to say. And they started creating courses to investigate so that they would be able to broaden their own levels of awareness, and also to increase, I think, the access to Islam as a resource rather than Islam, as the obstacle. And before I go to, we already have a question in the chat that I want to ask. But before I go there, I want to just take a moment to kind of talk about your book with regard to your Sufi Sheikh. In particular, can you, if you're comfortable, share with us how it is that, because for me, I see there another riff in our discourses is the relationship between spirituality and sexuality. And one of the first places where queer Muslims, sort of began to find their location in Islam was in the context of certain Sufi communities, because there is at least the niyyah, the intention to operate non-judgmentally. But I think even more will be needed in the future so that there is, a kind of serious integration, because sometimes there's sort of a don't ask, don't tell kind of location with regard to it, and that's safe. But I feel like in the don't ask and don't tell, there are silences that are being invoked, and the silences and invisibilities that create a separation between oneself and one's Lord. Can you tell us a little bit about your Sufi teacher, your relationship with the teacher, and also your decision to now actually write about it, which I'm looking forward to reading?
Well, yeah, thank you. I'm hoping that book will come out very soon. The last details are being worked out with the publisher, and then it gets sent on to the press. So hopefully by the end of the year that will come out. It's called The Merciful Door. That's the name of the book, The Merciful Door. And it's about my teacher, whose name was Syed Muhammad Rashid al-Hassan Jili Kalimi. And Amina, I'm very happy you got to meet him, actually, before he passed away. Remember in Hyderabad when you came to his house. So he was a extraordinary person, very simple in many ways. He was not an Islamic scholar, but he was a descendant of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. He was a Qadri Sayyid, and his father and his uncle and his grandfather before him had been Sufi teachers in this lineage. They were Qadri and also Chishti in their tariqah affiliations. From him, I didn't, it's not like I studied with him and learned from him Quran interpretation or studied Sharia with him. It's nothing like that. What I learned from him was purely on the level of virtues, human virtues, sort of the sweet water of spirituality. And the issue of gender and sexuality didn't come up so much between us. It did maybe after I knew him for 6 or 7 years. And I talk about that in the book in a way that's quite confessional and difficult for me. I don't normally talk about my own relationship to doubt and to Islamic figures who don't agree with me, because in the end, my Sufi Sheikh basically didn't agree with me on some of the issues about sexuality and sexual orientation. But on the other hand, he defended me from people who might have wanted me to get married in order to stay in the Sufi order. And he had none of that. He sort of said to them, no, he doesn't have to get married. That's not his fate. So I'll just say, read the book to get the full picture, because explaining it here wouldn't do justice to the kind of subtlety of his responses to me, which again, were not easy. They weren't saying, oh yeah, you're fine. You're fine. As a gay Muslim man, you're fine. He never said that.
Yeah, but
So
I think you know, this FAW, this taste of sweetness that Sufism offers is one of the things that are lost in the consequence of you can't be Muslim and gay, or Muslim and queer in any, because actually they say gay as in same sex, but literally it's a negation of the whole spectrum of sexual diversities. And the engagement that I had with the queer Muslim community really began as a kind of camaraderie with this idea that people become gatekeepers of this narrow-minded Islam, and that certain of us search instead for an Islam that is in full embrace. And so, yes, so it's not always that everything is talked about, but at least in the representation and reflection of Islam, there is that kind of openness. I think that when I observe over the last 20 years working, you know, in the context of, you know, queer Muslims, activism and artistry, when I observe the opportunities provided for them to taste that sweetness, there is this powerful transformation. The consequence is not just individual, but actually for me, Islam also becomes transformed. Islam becomes more compassionate. Islam becomes more inclusive. And Islam becomes more diverse. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing that in my friendship with you over the years, I've always felt that that's where you go. You've always gone back to the source of sweetness in your self-definition of Islam, and it impacts your scholarship, your, you know, your personal life, your spiritual practices, you know, as well as the communities that you gravitate towards, like Hyderabad. I think it's important to claim that integration, because I think that that provides sort of a guiding light for many, many queer Muslims who are struggling with being pushed back from their identity as Muslims.
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, it's my great hope that that sense of camaraderie and that sense of spiritual depth that you've experienced among queer Muslims, and I've experienced the same in the places that they can gather. And there are now more and more spaces like that, where queer Muslims can gather, can pray together, can, you know, they end up crying together because there's a lot of trauma and fear and joy at being able to not have to hide anymore, at least in the limited space of a gathering of 2 days or 3 days when we have retreats or workshops. It's my hope that those spaces will expand, and that more and more people will be invited in to those spaces, because they, when queer Muslims get together and pray together, for instance, it is a mighty powerful thing, because gender segregation is not an issue. So men, women, trans people, gender ambiguous people all stand together shoulder to shoulder. Women give the azan, trans people serve as the imam. There's no sense of anybody who's the authority in that group. The authority to lead prayer circulates among them very freely. And for me, when I experience that and see it, you know, it feels like this is what Islam should be.
Yeah.
This is what Islam was like in the time of the Prophet, I think.
Yeah.
The sense of shared leadership, a sense of no boundary between people who all have a commitment to the truth and a commitment to uphold each other's dignity and a commitment to be vulnerable around each other.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think your experience with queer Muslims that way, it rhymes with mine. And those spaces are few and far between, but I hope that they do grow. And I think probably, most women who have been excluded from mosque spaces, when they get together in an all women space, probably feel that same electricity and that same sense of empowerment and freedom to pray together. But that can happen in a gender shared space also, when there's a queer intentionality behind it. I think in the future, more and more straight people are going to be gravitating toward this as well. I really hope that
I'm actually
straight
seeing that.
allies and friends.
I'm seeing that as well. The places are inclusive. So the participation of, hetero men and women is increasing. Obviously, it started more with het women, cis het women, but that's one of the things about being in those inclusive spaces that I like, because I get to be my own identity wherever on the spectrum that I am. And I don't have to fit into, sort of this hegemonic model, what it means to be female. So I'm going to open for questions from the gallery. Please find your little hand raising feature in the Zoom. In the meantime, there's a question from Amar. Professor Scott, thank you for your amazing work. They all gave space, hope, and affirmation for trans Muslim like me in a very difficult way to find reconciliation between gender, identity, and Islam. I'm wondering if your books have been translated into other languages. If yes, what are the challenges in the process? And if not, how would you and others open up that possibility, as the translations would be very important for queer people with non-English capacity?
Yeah, thank you, Amma. That's a great question, and it's a difficulty. It's a real difficulty. My works have not been translated into other languages, as far as I know, at all. So they exist only in English, not even other European languages, not French, which of course would reach a wide and diverse Muslim audience if it were translated into French, because of the colonial history there. But the book that we were talking about earlier, the Progressive Muslims book that came out in 2002, I know that there were offers to translate it into Arabic by a publisher in the Middle East, but they said, oh, yes, chapter 8 should be left out. So chapter 8 was the one I contributed on homosexuality in Islam. So that was a blockage for many publishers. And it says a lot about the ethics of the editor, Omid Safi, that he refused to think about publishing it without all of the chapters there. So I appreciate that about him. But no, I would really love this book to be translated, especially into Bahasa. I've had some amazing discussions with people in Indonesia, and there's an indigenous kind of community in Indonesia. You probably all know more about it than I do, of very engaged people, rethinking Sharia and rethinking Islam from a feminist and queer-friendly point of view. And so I think if my work were translated into Indonesian, there would be a great audience for it, and I would get a great kind of response and dialogue with it. But it hasn't happened yet. And frankly, this is a failure of mine. I haven't been pushing to do this. And I don't know quite what it takes to get your works translated. Amina, your work has been translated into many languages for quite a long time. So maybe you can give me advice. But I always think it's not really my job to market it and to work with publishers to get the translation. It's kind of beyond my capacity and knowledge, but I would be happy to cooperate with anybody who wanted to translate and publish a translation.
Yeah, I think usually the initiative is from the host of the language, and the technicalities of publication, copyrights, and the actual, tedious process of translation has to be something that someone is willing to take on. And then they also have to be willing to advocate for, the publishing of that translation. So I've been blessed in that people have decided to take on my work at certain levels, but I couldn't have done it. So don't worry, it's not really something that you have been amiss on. Other questions? Anybody want to speak directly or put a question in the chat? Because I have my own conversation and I'm going to keep it up. And one is to talk about this relationship between the academy and activism with regard to queer Islam. There is often a disparity, a wedge that is pushed between these two. I remember at one AIR conference in South Africa, I was talking about the Tawhidi paradigm and other, abstract theological notions. And a young queer Muslim basically said, you guys are up there talking with all these 3-syllable words, and I don't know what you're talking about. And, and I said, we are still a very small community. And therefore, we can't afford to try to disown those, within this struggle, and that I have certain things that I can contribute. It happens to be in this 3-syllable abstract way, but you don't want to close off my contribution because it presents a challenge to you, because it is part of this affirmation. And so that was me being able to own, what it is that I have to offer, in the context of, queer Islamic studies and theology. And it never came up again, but I'm just saying that the idea sometimes that if you do something that's too academic, that it's not active enough. And that if you do something with the activists, it's not academic enough. We're still plagued by that a little bit. And I wondered what you thought on that.
We're very much plagued by that. I've had a similar experience when at various activist forums. Young activists are bold and they're taking great risks, and they're really impatient. And so they're pushing for change as quickly as possible, because they see the urgency of it. They see that people are being harmed, not just hindered, but harmed actively by the current setup, by the silence, by the non-recognition of many mainstream Muslim communities, by sometimes the cruelty of families, sometimes the betrayal of friends that they trusted. This research has been hard for me because it's very painful. I encounter some of the people that I interviewed for my book just had the most painful stories, like families conspiring against them, people being kidnapped by their own family, having their passport taken away from them when they were outside of their home country visiting family, being forced into marriage, especially women who were queer or lesbian, being forced into marriages by their own family members, people they love. So, seeing that kind of pain in their own life story and in the story of their friends and colleagues makes people really fiery and impatient. And so many times they don't have patience for the academic discourse or the idea that, okay, Islamic theology is evolving. They go, well, yeah, how many centuries are you going to ask of us? Like, we're waiting for Islamic theology to evolve. They're like, give us a break. No, we're not going to wait for that. Like, if Islamic theology can't evolve quickly enough to keep up with us, we're jettisoning it. We don't need it. We don't want it. Now, I think that's foolish because, of course, they do need Islamic theology. We all do. Anybody who's a Muslim needs Islamic theology, right? We all have a theology, whether we articulate it or whether it's just kind of like something inherited and in the back of our minds. But that's a problem that you've identified, and it's something that I've encountered also. And it's slowly going to be bridged, I think, as more students are able to engage with Islamic theology, especially its feminist and progressive and gender queer aspects. And that's beginning to happen more and more. Now in masters, it's hard for students to get that at the undergraduate level. But at the level of a master's degree program, it's possible they could get access to that. And if they choose where to go for a PhD, they can choose from among the very few professors who are training students in this kind of work. But it's going to become more and more common, I really hope, unless there's a vicious backlash.
Which can also happen, but we hope not.
It can happen.
I mean, it happened in terms of even working on gender, within mostly the binary normative rubric. And that was that there was an impatience with regard to the actions that were determined as necessary to achieve the policies that needed to be reformed. And we had to push. I mean, Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesian feminists are very much aware of the necessity of wedding the scholarship with the activism. And I experienced that, being in Malaysia and then constantly, returning to this region. And so I kind of, for some naive reason, well, I thought we fixed that. And then when I started doing things with regard to this initiative for queer Islamic studies and theology, I got pushed back, by the activists, like, oh no, you should go over there, to do that. And so it's, you just sort of start over again from ground zero to show that we are part of a continuum of Islam and Islamic thought. And the contributions that queer Muslims are making in our generation at this time, I don't mean generation, I mean, I'm 70, I'm in my 70th year. I'm not in a generation of anybody that's mostly active in this area, but in our time, that is today, we are experiencing transformations with regard to Islam, Islamic spirituality, Islamic ritual practice, notions of authority, and these are by the actions of certain people. So in other words, we are shaping that kind of theological transformation by our actions and understanding the continuity between those actions and this thing called Islam as a living, way of life. It's important, and one of the aspects of this KIST initiative is to make sure that, as my transcripts used to say, no conversations about me without me, that queer Muslims become representatives of, queer Islam, that you can't talk about Black politics and not have any Black people. So you can't talk about queer Islam and have no relationship to, those who are living out. At the same time, you're right, I resonate with the impatience that those who have been working on the front lines, because as soon as you come out in any degree, you will experience a pushback. And so there is a kind of impatience. But I think for those of us who have had the blessing of being able to straddle, the activism and the academic, it's important for us to sort of gently, become doulas, to give birth to this, collaboration, to not have it be something that's seen as the enemy of queer activism, and to not have the academics, which, to be honest, they're the most closed. They're closed to change. It doesn't give them the same level of authority, sort of elite privilege that they've had. But both sides need to be, I think, encouraged to move forward so that we birth, much more holistic, comprehensive, kind of inclusive, language and activism.
I write it in my book, but it needs to be stressed more and more that before I or any other academics came along to write about all this, there were discussions happening. Yeah. For at least a decade before I wrote anything, there were discussions happening at Al-Fatiha Foundation and other organizations. People, queer Muslims would get together. They would say, let's look at the story of Lut and his people. And people who didn't know Arabic would say, let's open up the Quran in English translations and let's get as many translations as we can here, 8, 9 of them, and people sitting in a circle and they're saying, okay, how does this verse get translated in your book? How does it get translated in your book? And then observing that the translations are not the same, right? So some English translators actually use the word homosexual or homosexuality in the actual translation. Others put it in brackets, others put it in a footnote, others leave it out entirely because there is no word.
There is no word.
To translate easily as homosexuality in the Quran as a whole. So they're coming to that because of the burning questions that they have. Now, how to take that and articulate it in Islamic theological language is a different story. And that's what academics and professional writers can do. But the questions and the search for answers had been going on long before anybody sat down to write it. And I think we need to keep an eye on that because it's out of activism, facing injustice, pushing back against it, that the questions come. And then much later, some egghead academic like myself or you will come along and write it, right? That's how I feel.
We have a question in the chat from Ibu Liz, and this is a really sticky one. So get ready. There's a huge debate in Indonesia right now on consent. If there is no concept of consent, and she wrote in Islam, I'm just going to say sort of in Islamic law, there's no concept of consent in Islamic law. How would you explore that concept, say, for example, in the Quran? Have you dealt with this concept of consent?
Difficult. I would say that the question is very astute because the medieval or classical era jurists, who were all elite men, did not really envision consent as being part of sexual intercourse. Not in straight marriage, not in a nikah, and not in other kinds of relationships, slavery, for instance. Many of the homosexual relationships that we know of were structured by slavery, to be honest, in a pre-modern period, like a sultan and his slave, or a scholar who had slaves. And they were male-male relationships, but they were structured, not as equal partners. And consent was not an issue. So that's a fundamental gap. It's a fundamental lack in Islamic law for straight people as well as queer people. And we have to go back to the source to do that. And the source is looking at human dignity, right? About this idea of karama, or dignity, where in the Quran it says that inna karamna bani Adam, we have dignified or raised in dignity the children of Adam, not because of anything that they've done, but just because of their adamiyya, because of their humanity. They have a certain dignity. And with that dignity comes freedom of choice. Also, with it comes the responsibility for taking on the consequence of choices. But consent to sex would be integral to any sense of human dignity for women and for men. And anything that violates that, I would say, can't be seen as legitimate. And that would make most Islamic marriages not legitimate. So that's a tough one.
I think
I just
it's
because
it did. Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. Because it didn't exist as a concept in Islamic law, we have to construct it And the elements of the construction of it, I agree, would be, like karama, like dignity, but also like agency. There is a disparity between who is considered to be a full agent, especially when you still have approval of institutions like slavery, and in my mind, like the whole rubric of patriarchy. And when we choose to dismantle those rubrics of operation like patriarchy, one of the things that we come to understand, for example, in the gender movement, is that the notion of equality was not a part of the notion of justice. Well, the notion of karama, of dignity, and the notion of agency is a part of a different rubric of bodily integrity that did not exist for women, for slaves, for minors, male or female. And just because it did not exist does not mean it is not integral. So we have to construct it. And the whole idea that, everything in Islam has to come from something in the past, well, we dismantled that when we started dealing with gender, especially gender equality. And so we need to bring it in. We need to construct new ways of thinking about Islamic law, Islamic practice, and consent has to, we have to talk about it seriously, and we don't, because, just like there wasn't a word for homosexuality, it took 500 years for it to become the term liwat. And even that is a derived term, which didn't have a fixed meaning, it evolved. So likewise with understanding, as I say, equality as part, of justice, understanding consent as part of sexuality, we need to make it happen. That's what I think, because Islam is living. It's not just something that, everything they talked about in the past covers everything that's supposed to happen now. No, they gave us a trajectory. If we follow that trajectory, the whole idea of, did we lose Scott? Oh, there you are. The whole idea of, consent is important, because coercive sex, including rape and marriage, was not a category. And even the whole rubric of rape was such that even in the 21st century, there are countries talking about the way to solve the problem is that the man who raped this girl should marry this girl. That's messed up. We have to be honest. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's messed up. And frankly, that's an aspect of the story of the prophet Lut, right? If you remember, there's a moment in the story where the crowd of his people is kind of breaking down his door because he's harbored a male guest that they're demanding. And he says, "These are my daughters, take them because they're pure for you." There's no consent there, right? He didn't ask his daughters. He's basically giving his daughters to a mob that wants to rape somebody. So my argument in that verse is that he's not serious. Lut is not seriously giving his daughters to a mob of rapists. But what he's saying is, just like you would never expect a father to give his daughter to a rapist, you can't ask me to give my guests to you. So the guests are more valuable to me, more precious to me, and better protected than my daughters, who you expect me to protect. That's what I thought. But when I wrote about that, a friend and colleague of ours, Keisha Ali, wrote and said, you've missed it. Like, the whole issue of consent is important here, and you didn't raise it at all. Siraj Kugle. So every time you start to peel away some of the layers of the problem and try to shine light on it, there's deeper, darker layers. So the issue of consent in any relationship is extraordinarily important. And we now have many issues, many instances, you could say, of sexual abuse or harassment of male Islamic authorities over male students or murids or others in their community. And it's becoming more and more apparent that the issue of sexual abuse is not of men over women only, but that it is also a male to male issue. And so consent, even in queer circles, in gay and lesbian circles, we have to address it. It's not easy. So your question is really good, Ibulis. Thank you.
So
I think
Usman Hamid, you have raised your hand. Please address your question.
Thank you, Ibu Amina, and thank you, Professor Scott. I really enjoyed the discussions. I'm wondering whether you could explore more on, for example, the story of Lut, in the sense that, you know, the revelation at the time was talking about husbands who were leaving their wives in order to come for, you know, other men's for having sexual relationship. Of course, homosexuality is one issue, but I think it was also about consent. So you can't have sexual relationship without, you know, or by leaving your wife, for example. So that's one of my interpretation of that verse. And secondly, although it wasn't very clear on the concept of consent in Islam, I agree with Ibu Amina that we should reconstruct it. But I really want to go back into the concept of marriage, or the origins of marriage, in which I believe it came from the backgrounds of, you know, partly was about sexual slavery at the time, or men having more or many women without, you know, without having an arrangement of relations. And also even in Islam, I think even for men and women who are couple, for example, husband and wife, there are some norms where the Prophet asking or banning or giving the rights to women to refuse having sexual intercourse with their husbands if they have, for example, menstrual period, or they have the right to refrain from having an abnormal sexual position, or, for example, during fasting hours in Ramadan. So I do believe there are some elements of consent within Islam, including the origins of marriage, in which it was for having more well-structured, sorry to use this word, consents, because and even the first about having 1, 2, 3, 4 wives, it was radical in a context where men have even dozens of wives, or even more than hundreds of wives at the time. So I believe that we should explore more on that concept of consent, and I also agree that we should reconstruct some of the verses in a way that it is in line with the concept of dignity, the al-karamah al-insaniyah, in as high as possible. So I really want to hear more on that 3 points. Sorry, I off video, but thank you for your kind response, Professor.
Thanks for your question. You know, like most difficult things, there are resources in the Quran to try to solve it, and there are also moments in the Quran that seem to make the problem worse. So if you're talking about consent to sexual intercourse, of course, there's the beautiful verse in the Quran that says, you know, you are a garment for them, meaning your wives, and they are a garment for you, right? It's a beautiful reciprocal imagining of what sexual relations are, that you cover your partner and she covers you. There's a sense of mutuality, of reciprocal relation. That would be the basis for talking about consent within marriage, I think. But then, of course, we have the verse Is it from Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, 228, which says your women are like a field and plow them as you will, the Hirth verse. So that would seem to mean not much issue of consent for men to be able to engage in sex however or whenever they want. So again, these are verses that need to be unwrapped, to be explained, to be put in a context of a certain ethical framework. And unfortunately, in our tradition, the early jurists didn't do that. They found license for some of the worst aspects of male dominance and patriarchy in those verses. And we need to take those verses back from the earlier patriarchal interpretations and balance them with verses which were left out by the jurists completely. So that's my suggestion. And this is work that has to be done by all of us together as a Muslim community. It can't be the work of one or two scholars publishing here and there. This is the work of a community. And hopefully we're engaging in it now. We'll push it forward in the future. But, you know, it's not easy.
You know, Musawad currently has a project on what they call Adl and Ihsan in Islamic marriages. They are trying to unpack concepts of marriage and then to reconstruct them on things like mawaddatan wa rahma or libasuhunna, protecting garments and mercy and loving intimacy. And so we do have to continue with these projects. Again, for me, the motivation is because Islam is a living tradition and we are part of that. We are well past our time. I'm sorry I couldn't get the other questions in the chat. Out of respect for the fact that I do want people to view these later when I post them on my YouTube channel for the public and the time of day for Professor Scott Kugle. I am going to close. I want to say thank you, Scott. I love you. It was just fantastic. I hope we have other opportunities to continue with these conversations, not just between the two of us, but also with others like those who have joined me. So I want to thank you all for joining me. And
thank you. I love you and miss you too. And I thank you for inviting friends into our conversation, because it's wonderful to be able to hear your questions and to share with you. So thank you for hosting us and inviting us.